Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I promise I will not speak for 45 minutes. Having said that, don't cut my time too quickly. Honourable Senators, I rise today to speak to the third reading of Bill C-45. Let me begin by taking the time to recognize the substantial work that has taken place in the Senate over the last few months, and that involves everyone in this room. Honourable colleagues, we said right from the beginning that the goal of the Conservative caucus was not to be obstructionist with this bill. We insisted on constructive evaluation, and we have done that. Our goal as senators is to work to promote and preserve the best interests of the Canadian population simultaneously. Many hours have been dedicated to the study of Bill C-45. While the government insisted on a speedy passage of this bill to be provided by April 27th, that was not our view, and we demanded the thorough and transparent debate that is poised to conclude today. Au sujet de ces implications multiples.
Now, the 5 Senate committees that considered Bill C-55 heard the testimony of the First Nations, representatives of provincial, municipal and territorial governments, healthcare professionals, substance abuse experts, representatives from law enforcement, American attorneys, Canadian lawyers who specialise in cross-border legal issues, international law, transportation professionals and road safety professionals, ministers, officials, public servants of the federal government, and of course a number of speakers and stakeholders and groups that will have to deal with the ramifications of this legislation throughout Canada.
To all witnesses that came before us, your voices have been heard. We listened to the serious issues that you have raised, and as an official opposition, we have made every effort to ensure that your concerns are heard by the government. We have heard significant concerns related to the implications that this legislation will have on our youth, on the safety of our communities, on our neighbourhoods and streets, and to be frank, on some of the most vulnerable in our society. Too many Canadians are still inadequately informed by the government on the implications and potential consequences of this legislation. Some of the consequences include greater risk for our youth given the impact that marijuana consumption can have on the development of brain under the age of 25 years. Greater challenges for law enforcement and first responders in dealing with the consequences of marijuana legalization on our roads and highways, i.e. no testing equipment to determine THC levels. Impacts on job performance and job safety given what will be a likely increase in recreational marijuana use. A greater availability of marijuana in our communities, in particular for youth. Wide-ranging health challenges and resulting implications for our public health system. Implications for cross-border travel by Canadians who may use marijuana legally in Canada, but with no expectation that the discovery of this fact may lead to a lifetime ban from entering the United States. Implications for the smooth flow of cross-border trade if Canadian travelers end up facing greater scrutiny at border from U.S. Customs officers. Now, obviously, I will not deal with the myriad of issues that I presented, but I've picked 3. Public education and awareness. The government's official declaratory objective for this legislation is to better protect the public by legalizing and regulating marijuana. Please allow me to quote from the Act directly. The purpose of the Cannabis Act is to protect public health and public safety, Clause 7. Its purpose is to protect the health of young persons by restricting their access to cannabis, deter illicit activities related to cannabis, reduce the burden on the criminal justice system, and enhance public awareness of the health risks associated with cannabis use, unquote. The intentions are clearly identified in the legislation, but that seems to be the extent of the effort that has been made actually to implement the objectives. Although the government claims to be aware of the importance of a public awareness campaign, Canadians have yet to see any real effort made to communicate honestly and openly with them about the implications of this legislation. It's one thing to claim the marijuana public education and awareness campaign is a priority, but it's another to actually make it a priority. Normally, when a government initiative is launched, Goals and targets are set and key deliverables are identified. Targeted and strategic communication products are prepared to help Canadians understand any potential implications of a pending change in public policy. I cannot understand why the government has not done that in this case. Through our studies of this bill, it is clear that Canadian children and youth will be more exposed to marijuana than they have been before. Evidence from other jurisdictions who have legalized marijuana confirms that organized crime does not disappear when marijuana laws are removed or loosened, and greater accessibility to that product is inevitable. It is odd that the government does not wish to draw attention to this. Instead, they are claiming the opposite will happen and that organized crime and accessibility to illicit cannabis will be reduced. Through our studies of this bill, we have found that this is not to be the case. Since the beginning of our evaluation of this bill, we have personally raised questions, and I've raised questions on the lack of educational campaigns with the Minister of Health during Committee of the Whole that took place in February. At that time, the Minister promised that the campaign would start in March. On March 21st, I sent a letter to the Health Minister as a follow-up on the status and implementation of the educational campaign, as I had not yet seen the rollout of any meaningful campaigns. March came and went with no update on their plan to educate Canadians. Le 11 avril, j'ai demandé encore une fois le ministre.
On the 11th of April, again I called on the Minister of Health to meet for a briefing session with Senator Carignan-Seidman and myself, mainly to do with the public education campaign, and my request was denied.
To have an update meeting, it never happened. On May 11th, the Health Minister responded to my request for further information on the rollout plan of this national public education campaign. The Health Minister said it would be launched in March 2018. It became evident in the response that the national campaign was a Health Canada questionnaire and answer website on marijuana. A more substantive public education campaign remains to be delivered to Canadians. Preparation for today's speech, I happened upon the following quotation from our Prime Minister. The quotation includes the following phrase: "I am a teacher. It's how I define myself." How can the Prime Minister of Canada, who identifies himself as a teacher, valuing the importance of providing tools required for people to succeed, not see the crucial importance of ensuring that people are prepared for the serious challenges that are likely to result from the very legislation that he is proposing? The government's failings on the matter of public awareness is significant, and I predict it will be most immediately apparent as questions are asked post-legalization, for which the government will have few, if any, answers. One example of the lack of certainty concerning potential implications post-legalization between Canada and U.S. border is one I raised 4 months ago. I posed some detailed questions to the Minister of Public Safety regarding the number of times he has raised the treatment of Canadians at the border who admit to prior marijuana use with his counterpart at the United States Department of Homeland Security. To date, absolutely no answers have been provided. Why would that be? The lack of information related to many consequences of Bill C-45 should be subject of real concern to every senator in this chamber. Now, another issue, First Nations. I wish to also discuss the matter of consultations with our First Nations people. We have heard a lot from some senators in this chamber and in committee about the obligation of the government to engage in meaningful consultations when policy initiatives directly impact First Nations communities. I find particularly troubling is the lack of culturally and linguistically sensitive public education materials available for Indigenous communities. We had Indigenous young people with us yesterday. I had a chance to talk to 8 to 10 of these young people. I asked the question, this is the answer I received, the same answer: no culturally sensitive programs. The Standing Senate Committee on Aboriginal Peoples heard loud and clear that these materials were still in the process of being prepared, and there had been a lack of meaningful consultations with their communities. All of these concerns remain only a few weeks and days from legalization. The committee has heard clear evidence from Indigenous health organizations that a linguistically appropriate approach to education is necessary in order to meet the needs of Indigenous people. Such an approach would allow Indigenous communities to shift from what the National Native Addictions Partnership Foundation has called a fear-based response to one that would be a strength-based harm reduction approach in relation to the impact of marijuana. Given that we have heard continuously from the government that a central pillar of Bill C-45 is to protect youth, it is troubling that no public education campaign that is linguistically appropriate for Indigenous communities has been launched to date. What is surprising about this with regards to the Indigenous community is that a unanimous recommendation put forward by the Aboriginal Peoples Committee to require the minister to table a comprehensive report responding to concerns related to legalization and its impact on Indigenous communities was rejected by independent Liberal senators at the Social Affairs Committee. These concerns included the matters of tax sharing, the development of appropriate educational materials and programs, the need for funding and establishment of mental health and addiction programs, the need for residential treatment and healing centers, and the need for adequate nursing and policing services. On this issue, it seems the ideology of marijuana legalization trumped the ideal of adequate consultation. Now, yesterday, we heard Senator Harder read a letter from the government at the 11th hour stating they will do a review, they will address infrastructure needs, they will develop a culturally sensitive education program. That's great. Another promise made. The question, will this promise be kept? We will see. Respect and power balance, final subject. A final matter I wish to reference is the need to respect the constitutional responsibilities of the provinces and the balance of responsibilities between the federal and provincial governments. L'Assemblée nationale du Québec.
The Quebec National Assembly determined that in the best interests of Quebecers, lawful marijuana should not be produced, only produced by permitted producers, and the minister responsible for intergovernmental relations stated that Quebec is entitled to prevent homegrown marijuana, home cultivation, to in fact prevent the trivialization of cannabis use among youth. He added, and I quote, that home cultivation prevents us from providing relevant information and to determine whether or not particular individuals have specific needs related to the use of cannabis. And he also stressed that Quebec's goal is to constrain or limit the unlawful market. And that there should not be a personal chain of producers. A few weeks ago, he reiterated that the Prime Minister reiterated they wanted to go ahead with the home cultivation provision.
Regardless of what Quebec said. In other words, under Prime Minister Trudeau's vision of federalism, the Quebec nation and the elected officials of the National Assembly don't have a voice on the application of this new act. There is, therefore, a conflict that must be resolved between Quebec, which is seeking to protect its inhabitants, and the federal government, which refuses to listen to Quebec.
Its desire to ban home cultivation. Justice Minister Heather Stephenson and Health Minister Kelvin Gertson have referenced the various serious public health and safety concerns that flow from this proposed legislation. Specifically, they call for an amendment to Bill C-45 which would provide certainty that the province and territories that they will be able to have the legislative authority to further restrict home cannabis production. Both the provinces of Manitoba and Quebec have been firm that Bill C-45 must address this issue to help avoid legal challenges in the future. It is very important that this issue be addressed in the amendment made to the legislation at the Social Affairs Committee, a recommendation that was also unanimous with members of the Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee. I think it's fair to say that it therefore reflects a strong consensus of support in this chamber, and it reinforces the central role that the Senate must play in reflecting regional concerns. We will be watching very closely for the federal government's response to this amendment, which I think will test the current government's depth of commitment to flexible federalism and its willingness to permit provinces to respond to Bill C-45 in a manner that at least preserves some ability to protect their own citizens. Conclusion, and that's fantastically faster than 45 minutes. Senators, I remain concerned about the serious flaws in Bill C-45. Senators opposed in this senators opposite in this chamber have made references to this bill as a social experiment. They say it's a type of legislation that the government should be introducing in order to test new social and legal concepts. In particular, and I quote, "We'll learn as we go," end of quote. But of course, for the most part, we will not be the ones who have to deal with the resulting growth of marijuana accessibility in communities and to children. We may not be the ones potentially denied entry into the United States for past marijuana use as American scrutiny of Canadians at the border increases, nor be members in the Indigenous communities forced to deal with legalization and having insufficient resources. While I do believe that senators have made some modest improvements to this legislation, the bill remains fundamentally flawed. The government has been focusing on ensuring that marijuana would be made legal this summer instead of ensuring that Canadians are duly protected. This is especially clear in the introduction of over 50 technical amendments to clean up some of the discrepancies within the bill. 50 technical amendments. When Bill C-45 becomes law, it will change lives. It will have an impact on our children, on our grandchildren, and in communities from coast to coast to coast. This is not a bill that will impact the few, rather one that will impact all Canadians in more ways than one. Moving forward, I hope that we can work together to ensure that all Canadians are respected, with their voices continuing to be heard. Colleagues, in summary, this bill is about how do we manage risk. Do we do more work at the front end to potentially reduce risk, or do we scramble as we go forward to repair problems as unintended consequences which arrive from this social experiment? Thank you very much.
Senator Mitchell, on debate.
On debate. Madam Speaker, thank you very much. Colleagues, as I looked at the list of speakers today, I'm convinced that there will be many, many very interesting speeches on third reading of C-45, but it'll come as a surprise to you, this won't be one of them. Yeah, I know. So I'm going to make it as quick as possible. However, it is an opportunity for me to speak to something upon which there is broad agreement. I understand that there is. This is two technical amendments to an amendment that was passed by the Social Affairs Committee and is in the report now. The problem is that upon reflection, two issues and concerns have arisen. One is that while the desire of the committee and subsequently of the chamber was to ensure that both a Senate committee and a parliamentary committee, a committee of the House of Commons, would review after 5 years, the wording is such that it might be either or. So to specify, and secondly, in the second subsection, this is 151.31 and 151.32. In the second subsection, because we're going to have two committees reporting, we have to specify an S on the committees rather than the committee. So I will read I will move, and in doing so, I will read the amendment. I move that Bill C-45 be not now read a third time, but that it be amended on page 91 by replacing clause 151.3, bracket, added by decision of the Senate on May 30th, 2018, bracket, with the following. 151.3 sub 1. 5 years after this section comes into force, a committee of the Senate and a committee of the House of Commons are to be designated or established for the purpose of reviewing this act. Sub 2. The committees designated or established for the purpose of subsection 1 must undertake a comprehensive review of the administration and operation of this act and must, within a reasonable period after the review, cause a report on the review, including any findings or recommendations resulting from it, to be laid before each House of Parliament. What do you want to send it?
In English or French? Senator Mitchell, second.
How do you write Mitchell in
Senator
French?
Harder. That Bill C-45 be not read a third time, but that it be amended on page 91 by replacing clause Win 51.3. Dispense, may I dispense? Are you ready for the question, Senators? Is it your pleasure, honourable Senators, to adopt the motion in the amendment? Carried. Senator Gold.
Am I up or not?
Yes, she said your name.
Oh. Merci.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Honorable Senators, supporting this bill was relatively easy for me. I have always thought that criminal law was the wrong tool for dealing with cannabis possession and use. In fact, I started leaning towards marijuana legalization at the end of the 1960s. So when the government tabled Bill C-45 in Parliament last year, I admit that I started supporting it quite early on. I spent my last winter vacation attentively studying the bill and concluded that it was a reasonably well-designed response to a public policy issue that it was facing, namely, in my reading, the social problems caused by the criminalization of cannabis possession and use in Canada. It wasn't perfect. But what bill is? But I concluded that it deserved my support, and I said so in this place. In my speech at second reading, I gave the 5 following reasons for which I supported Bill C-45. First of all, our current approach of criminalizing cannabis use is a complete and total failure. It did not successfully reduce cannabis use in Canada, either among youth or among adults, and it has resulted in a vast illegal, unregulated market dominated by crime. Secondly, the criminalization of cannabis possession has seriously compromised our ability to educate Canadians, particularly youth, about the real health risks tied to cannabis consumption. Thirdly, the continuous criminalization of cannabis undermines the respect of Canadians for the criminal law and the justice system in general. Fourthly, the consequences of the criminalization harm all Canadians in the criminal justice system, and the consequences disproportionately affect youth and the most vulnerable populations. And finally, the bill strikes a healthy balance between the legitimate role of Parliament and the provincial legislative assemblies in response to the health, educational, and social aspects of cannabis use in our country.
Hearings or during this debate in this chamber has given me any reason to change my mind. And on the contrary, based upon the evidence that we heard, I'm even more convinced that Bill C-45 is not only a reasonable response to the social problem, it is the appropriate response. But the months, I should say, of study and debate have done much more than simply reinforce my initial support for the bill, for I have learned a great deal in the course of our studies. I learned that although there are real health risks associated with cannabis use, they are not as serious as opponents of the bill would make them out to be. But at the same time, I learned a great deal more than I knew before about some of the negative impacts that cannabis use has had in many Indigenous communities. I also learned that legalization will open up important avenues of research that has been sorely lacking due to the criminalization of cannabis, research that will be critical to better understanding both the risks and the benefits, the possible benefits of cannabis use, and research that will inform our ongoing efforts to educate Canadians about how to approach cannabis use in a responsible manner. And most importantly, honourable Senators, I learned a great deal about our legislative process here in the Senate and how we can and indeed do add real value in the discharge of our obligation to review proposed legislation. And much of what I learned was positive. I thought that the fact that we structured the process in terms of fixed dates and themes, both at committee and in the chamber, was very helpful in addressing the range of issues in a thorough and coherent manner. Now, regardless of one's position on the legalization of cannabis, and reasonable people do and will continue to disagree, all, I think, would agree that Bill C-45 is a historic and very complex piece of legislation. And for my part, I'm much more than satisfied that all relevant issues were canvassed comprehensively and in great depth. And just as we did in our debate on medically assisted dying, this structured approach to Bill C-45 will serve us well when we confront other equally challenging pieces of legislation. In that regard, we owe a vote of thanks to the leaders of all groups in this Senate for working together to organize our study of the bill in an effective manner. And we owe a special vote of thanks to Senator Dean for the open, balanced, and nonpartisan approach he took to his role as sponsor. And although one is not supposed to mention senators who are not present, with leave of this Senate, may I also offer our thanks collectively to Senator Seidman, who fulfilled her role as opposition critic in her usual and typical professional and constructive manner. Yeah. So, honorable senators, I conclude where I began. In my opinion, Bill C-45 is the appropriate response to the social problem caused by the criminalization of cannabis use in Canada. Implemented sensibly and monitored appropriately, Bill C-45 will move us forward in addressing the real issues associated with cannabis use by Canadians of all ages, of all backgrounds, and of all circumstances. Clearly, I support Bill C-45. I encourage you to do the same. Thank you.
Do you have a question, Senator? Senator Gold, would you accept a question? Senator Lovelace-Nicholas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Don't you think that prescribed medical marijuana is better than prescribing opioids?
Senator Gold.
Thank you for your question. The short answer is yes. I'm not a doctor, and so I wouldn't presume to know all the circumstances in which it would be helpful. But from my own experience, and I suspect most of us have experience with colleagues and friends and family members, there's no question in my mind that the responsible use and the supervised use of certain cannabis products for certain conditions provides enormous relief and benefit to Canadians. And it's certainly better than the use and overuse of prescription drugs like opiates, which, though necessary for pain relief in acute circumstances, has caused devastating negative impacts on so many thousands, if not millions, of users. Thank you for your question.
On debate.
Well, there's a question.
Oh, I'm sorry, Senator Deakin. Yes, Senator Gold, would you accept another question?
Yes, with pleasure.
Thank you, Honourable Senator Gold. As I listened today, I must say that the decision, contrary to what you may have expressed this afternoon, was not an easy one for me. I'm that newer independent senator who 15 weeks ago could not envision supporting the legalization of cannabis. I certainly learned, like many, very quickly the complexity, our vulnerability, the need to ask many questions.
Are you on debate or are you asking a question?
I'm going to ask a question. Yes, the need to do all of these things. As we've gone through the past six weeks and much more information, and from our different experiences, I'd like to ask you today, based on what you've said, do you believe that due diligence has been done at all levels in every corner possible? Do you believe that the prime purpose of this bill is still to help our youth and regulate cannabis? And do you believe that if this bill is passed, there will be an accountability and monitoring framework to ensure that all Canadians are educated to have a deeper understanding of their actions and decisions?
Senator Gold.
Thank you very much for your question. I think think there were 3 or 4 questions, so the answer is yes, 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 and yes, if there was a 4th one. With regard to due diligence, you know, let's leave aside the decades of work and study and reflection on this issue and just start with the task force. And let's leave aside the task force and the work that they did. The House of Commons studied this bill extensively, but most importantly, we did. And I don't have the statistics at hand. Dozens and dozens and dozens of committee meetings, hundreds of witnesses, hours and hours of debate, and good debate, some of our finest debates. So I'm more than satisfied that in the Senate and we have completed a process of very rigorous critical scrutiny and review. Vis-a-vis your question about the prime purpose, this is a complex issue of social policy, and therefore it's a complex bill, and therefore the bill has multiple purposes, and they're set out in Section 7 of the bill. Certainly protecting youth is one of them, and of great concern, but equally as well, the bill serves the important purposes of reducing the stigma and marginalization of adults and youth who are exposed to the criminal justice system through the criminalization of cannabis as it has been. And there are others, and I won't elaborate. It's going to be a long day. Vis-a-vis accountability and monitoring framework, there's a lot that we can say there, so I'll be very brief. The Act itself, as amended by the Social Affairs Committee and further amended here, provides clear review and reporting for the Senate. But there's more than that. We've heard talk and the importance of perhaps getting third-party independent monitoring of the legislation as it rolls out, because we can characterize it differently, but there will be bumps on the road. And it's not irresponsible to acknowledge that when we pass a complicated piece of legislation, but it is responsible to put into place monitoring mechanisms so that we can quickly respond as we need to be, with the flexibility and the diligence that the issues and Canadians require. But in addition to those formal mechanisms, let's not forget the power that we have in this place. We have, as in the Senate, the power to ask questions, to demand written answers, to hold the government to account. We have the ability through our committee system to demand reports. I'm getting caught up in this. I get excited. We have a lot of tools at our disposal. We can launch inquiries. We can insist upon timely reports. We don't have to wait 5 years to get information for how it's working. And we can use, if it's not an inappropriate term, the bully pulpit that we have as senators to bring these issues to the public attention. Unless, of course, and I've forgotten civil society, we get caught up in our little bubble on the Hill. The world is going to be watching. Our world, the media world, some of them are probably here today, and the rest of the world. So I have no doubt whatsoever that the implementation of this bill is going to be studied, it's going to be reviewed, it's going to be reviewed with critical eyes, especially by those who remain concerned, if not indeed fearful, of the consequences of what I believe and what I hope we'll do today if and when we pass this bill. So the answer then is yes. Thank you for your question.
Senator Huzekos.
Would Senator Gold take a question?
Of course.
Thank you,
Have
Senator.
I ever refused you before?
Never, sir. I can't recall ever an occasion. Very quickly, you referred to all the decades of work that the government has done, scientific work on this particular bill. Can you refer to us to any one study in the last 5 years that's been done by any ministry of the federal government to gather data science-based information? Other than, of course, a study that was commissioned by the Health Ministry earlier this year in February, March, in order to do an analysis of the wastewater treatment across this country, in order to garner information about how much marijuana is flowing through the system, which, by the way, I point out, has been commissioned in February, March. They haven't even started the work yet. But has there been any other database study by any other relevant ministry that maybe I missed?
You have a minute, Senator Gold.
Thank you for your question. I don't believe I said, because I wasn't intending to say that it was government studies over decades. I said that this is an issue that has been studied over the decades. It certainly was studied in the Ledane Commission. It was certainly studied in this place in the Senate committee. And it's certainly been studied by academic research and scientists and public policy issues over the years. So if I gave the impression, Senator Housakis, that I was referring to specific federal government studies, I apologize for that. What I meant to say was, and I think the point still stands, that this is an issue that thoughtful, experienced, serious people have been wrestling with, and properly so, wrestling with for decades. We didn't come to it like cold. So when the bill was introduced, it was based upon decades and decades of thoughtfulness, consideration, and experience with what the current criminalization, prohibition had brought and the havoc that it had wrought on our communities.
Senator Eggleton.
Honourable Senators, I rise to speak to this bill on our final segment of the third reading of Bill C-45, the Cannabis Act, as amended. During our study of the bill, your Social Affairs Committee heard from 136 witnesses over the course of 53 hours for a total of 19 meetings. This, in addition to considering the reports of 4 other Senate committees, needless to say, there was much debate and consideration of arguments. Now, during this time, I could not help but think that our country likely had similar debates around the lifting of prohibition on alcohol almost a century ago. And as it turns out, many of the same concerns we hear today were present then. So let's go through a little bit of history here. Prohibition of alcoholic products in Canada largely fell to the provinces. By 1917, all provinces but Quebec had put temperance into law. In my home province, prohibition was instituted in 1916 by the Ontario Temperance Act. This remained in place for about a decade until Conservative Party leader Howard Ferguson won a second term as Premier in 1926 by campaigning on a pledge to lift prohibition. That's sort of a reversal of roles, I would say. Anyway, like now, many feared what a post-prohibition world might look like. When Ferguson called the election, his Attorney General, W.F. Nicol, submitted his resignation, believing that the party's alcohol policy would, and I quote, lead to disaster in which I would not care to share. The Toronto Star editorial board stated that the elector must decide whether he wishes Ontario to abandon a law which has eliminated 2/3 of the drunkenness in Toronto and substitute a system which has increased drunkenness in Winnipeg by 40%. Calgary by 52%, and Senator Mitchell in Edmonton by 111%. And the Progressive Party, now here's another reversal of roles. The Progressive Party leader, William Rainey, stated that, quote, the Ontario Temperance Act has done much good by reducing temptation to the youth of Ontario, by producing a more sober citizen, by lifting homes from squalor, want, and crime, end of quote. Now, in spite of these concerns, Ferguson's Conservative government overturned prohibition by passing the Liquor Control Act, creating the Liquor Control Board of Ontario, known today as the LCBO, which is also in Ontario being given the responsibility to administer retail sales. Now, this system of regulation and government control over the dispensation of liquor has stayed with us for close to 100 years. What Bill C-45 aims to do is to introduce a system similar to that which Ferguson did in 1927. In fact, if you substitute his references to liquor with cannabis, Premier Ferguson may as well have been speaking today when he said, and I quote, listen to this legislation is designed not to suppress the liquor traffic entirely, but to control it. We're not here to increase the consumption of liquor. We're here to protect the people, especially the rising generation, from being poisoned under the vogue of the past few years, end of quote. So, colleagues, it is not my intention here to gloss over the struggle many Canadians experience with alcohol. It would be thoughtless to assert that all the harms associated with it have been eliminated. However, in spite of the warnings, social order in Ontario did not unravel when Prohibition was overturned.
That was later on.
Yes, it's unraveling today. On the contrary, when the Chief Public Health Officer looked at Canadian drinking habits in 2015, Ontarians had the second lowest incidence of heavy drinking of any province, as well as one of the lowest drunk driving rates. It must be said that some political leaders in Ontario have found this system so successful that they've suggested in this election campaign that ends today that we should put it now in corner stores. So, alcohol, that is. Oops. There we go. I believe we will see similar results from C-45. This, after all, is a harm reduction bill, not a harm elimination one. No one is arguing that cannabis can't cause harm, like alcohol, if it is used to excess. Rather, what it acknowledges is that our current approach towards the substance is broken. Our prohibitive approach does not deter its use. Canadians, particularly young Canadians, are some of the highest consumers of cannabis in the world. All Prohibition has done is prohibit a reasonable public health approach to cannabis consumption. Rather than buying a regulated product with the appropriate health warnings clearly labeled on the package, Canadians meet on sidewalks, back alleys, or in high school stairwells to make their purchase. They have no way of knowing the THC content of what they are consuming. Worst of all, Prohibition is fueling an illicit market, and the seller will likely have more addictive, destructive substances on offer. As our committee was told by Dr. Lafol, medical head of the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, CAMH, largest institution of its kind in this country dealing with mental health, we should take an overall public health approach, he said, not a criminal law approach. We can greatly reduce the harms of illicit drugs, including cannabis, by focusing on the underlying public health issues. Most of the harms are caused, he said, by the laws we have put into place rather than by the drugs themselves. This was a point reiterated by the Criminal Lawyers Association, who told us in simple terms, it is the criminalization of marijuana, not marijuana itself, that is responsible for these harms. Making matters worse is the fact that our present laws are unclear. Some Canadians, particularly young ones, think that possession is allowed as long as there's no intent to sell. As one witness said at the committee, quote, like the clerk at my local convenience store told me last year, having marijuana is legal one day a year, as long as it's done on 4/20, which is April 20th, on Parliament Hill. End of quote. These misunderstandings can have serious consequences. As recently as 2016, this is a serious figure, as recently as 2016, nearly 18,000 Canadians were charged for simple possession. And that is ultimately what I would like to speak to finally, and that is keeping Canadians, particularly young Canadians, from acquiring a criminal record for simply possessing cannabis for their own consumption. This bill proposes to limit personal possession for those under 18 to 5 grams of cannabis without running the risk of being criminalized. I must note that this will not allow underage youth to possess cannabis. If they're caught with any amount below this limit, they will almost certainly have it seized and face some kind of penalty determined by the provinces or municipality, similar to how Ontario sanctions those under 19 caught purchasing or possessing or drinking alcohol. They will not face a criminal punishment, and that is the utmost importance. It was at second reading in this chamber that the government was accused of giving its tacit approval for children to possess up to 5 grams of cannabis. Well, this is simply not true. It is my hope that no Canadian, be they an adult or a young person, will be burdened with a criminal record for simply possessing cannabis. I ask you to think back to when you were young the peer pressure involved in growing up. It's not far-fetched and nowadays to imagine one friend asking another to hold some of their weed so their parents won't find it. If they have some of their own already, this could put them over the 5-gram limit. Does he or she deserve a criminal record? Absolutely not. This is why Senator Seidman's amendment, adopted by our committee, was so important. It emphasizes, quote, that for greater certainty, nothing in this act is to be construed as limiting the operation of the extrajudicial measures that are provided for in the youth criminal justice system. Well, 2 examples of these extrajudicial measures include just basic warning from the intervening officer, or a referral to a community program, or even perhaps telling the parents with written notice. It is imperative that this act be applied equally to all Canadians as well. During our study, we were told a number of times that there has been an uneven application of the drug laws in our country. Put simply, racialized groups, Indigenous peoples, and low-income Canadians receive much harsher punishment than those Canadians who look more like me. There are several review mechanisms in this bill as amended. It is incumbent on those undertaking these reviews to determine if the sanctions proposed in the Cannabis Act, both for youth and adults, are being applied fairly to all segments in our diverse society. Honourable Senators, over the course of the debate, I've heard many different opinions on the potential effects of this legislation. The fact is that much of this is uncharted territory, and there will remain a number of unknowns no matter how well we prepare, no matter how well we do our due diligence. There is one thing I know for certain, and that is our current approach is broken. It needs to be fixed. As a legislator, to suggest that we stay the current course would be wrong. What we have before us today is a step toward a better approach, an important step away from a system that does more harm than good. And that is why I will be voting for Bill C-45. Thank you.
Senator Eggleton, would you accept a question?
I think the whole debate would have been different if this would have been just about decriminalization. But of the 16,000 people that you said were charged last year, how many of them were actually convicted?
Well, I don't have that figure, and I suspect it would be much smaller. I will say that. But you know, the minute you charge these people, you put them through into a trauma, and this can, in fact, create a lot of difficulties in their lives. Charged with the possibility of a criminal record is a very severe thing for possession for personal use of this substance, which is no worse than alcohol in terms of its effects. In fact, taken in moderation, anything taken in moderation is not going to be a problem, alcohol or cannabis. But to charge these people with a criminal offense, I think, is wrong. And so that's the one thing that will be corrected by this act. Now, you say decriminalization, but you've got to remember the other side of the coin, and that is that we still have, even with decriminalization, an illicit market out there. So this is a combination in the legalization of it, of both decriminalizing as well as getting control and getting regulation on an industry to eventually get rid of that illicit market of $7 billion.
Senator Ketchum?
I think we're all in, there would have been a whole different debate if we were discussing decriminalization. I just wanted to make a point as to how many people were actually found, were convicted rather than charged. But how is this bill going to stop the selling of now a legal drug, which is a lot different than presently, but now a legal drug to people that should not possess it, i.e. those people under the age of 18 years old?
Well, going back to my historical analysis, I mean, there used to be rum runners and all sorts of people in the illegal business of selling alcohol, but eventually that came under control. I mean, there's still elements around, of course. Nothing's ever perfect. But though the social order in this country has still been maintained as we moved out of that prohibition, and I believe it will happen in this one. It won't happen overnight, but I think as we educate people as we provide them with the kind of warnings and the kind of information that they need to be able to make decisions that affect their safety and their health, I think we will, which we can't do as long as it's an illegal substance, to the same degree at least, I think we'll see a lot of improvement in fixing of our system.
Senator Martin?
Yes, I have another question for Senator Eggleton.
You have a minute 15.
Oh, it will take longer. I was going to just highlight the concerns about the current infrastructure that is used for contraband cigarettes, which is, legal and highly regulated, and many warnings given, and what could happen to this product, this illicit product, which will become legal, but is illegal in other parts of the world. So there are some great concerns about that.
The use of tobacco, smoking tobacco, has fallen substantially in the last few decades. That's been a very successful program. I hope we will do the same kind of thing in terms of smoking in relation to cannabis. But I think we'll see that fall as well.